the weak rule of law and the challenge of organized crime, transnational organized crime in Mexico, have to be, and they're logically, a salient concern for the United States. They are Mexico's, in many ways, Achilles heels. The endemic corruption and the weak rule of law are a challenge not only to Mexicans, but to a secure and prosperous North American region. But at the same time, one of the greatest achievements of the past 2 decades was that successive Republican administrations and Democratic administrations, starting with George W. Bush and then with Obama, for the first time articulated something which Mexico had always said, which was that most of the issues in the US-Mexico bilateral relationship, you need a paradigm of joint responsibility. You're not going to be able to move the needle forward and to tackle issues like organized crime or flows of undocumented migrants into the United States, or issues of scarce water resources on the border, or infrastructure, if both countries don't work together to cut through Gordian knots. Because in a relationship, again, as complex and as convoluted historically as the one that we have between Mexico and the United States, if one of the two partners points one finger, it guarantees that three fingers will be pointing back at that country lifting the first finger, because there's the potential for so much mutual recrimination to go on here. For example, on the issue of drugs, for many decades, if you remember back to the days of the drug certification process on Capitol Hill and some of the operations that the U.S. Implemented on the border to prevent drug trafficking, for example, in the Nixon administration, we don't even have to remember what happened when a DEA agent was abducted and killed on Mexican soil in 1985. For many, many years, the United States would point its finger at Mexico and say, you're the springboard of all the drugs coming into the United States. And Mexico conveniently and jingoistically would answer, if we're the springboard, you're the swimming pool. Starting with the Bush administration and then with the Obama administration, both countries understood that we had to develop this paradigm of joint responsibility. That yes, Mexico had a very important job to do in strengthening the rule of law, in strengthening its judiciary, in taking on violent transnational organized crime. But at the same time, the US had an obligation to attack issues like demand and consumption in the US, or the still very important and salient issues of guns and bulk cash being illegally crossed from the United States into Mexico, which provide organized crime with the firepower and the monies that they need to continue intimidating, bribing, pushing back against the state. And that is just one example, but it happens across all fields of this bilateral relationship. In many ways, if you look at what makes up the day-to-day diplomatic relationship and agenda between Mexico and the United States, all the issues are really domestic issues. There's not one issue. Think of whether it's drugs, whether it's immigration, whether it's trade, whether it's border infrastructure, whether it's energy, whether it's scarce water resources on the border, whether it's joint maritime deposits of oil in the Gulf of Mexico. All of these issues are profoundly rooted in the domestic politics of the United States and Mexico. In many ways, what we have today in the US-Mexico relationship is an intermestic agenda, because the domestic and foreign policy issues are so entwined and so combined. In many ways, sort of riffing on Tip O'Neill's famous all politics is local, in the bilateral relationship, everything in the bilateral relationship is local. So this also means that it's not just Washington, D.C. and Mexico City and diplomats in Foggy Bottom and in the Mexican Foreign Ministry engaging. It means that everything from mayors and governors and trade associations and Rotary clubs and NGOs on both sides of the border provide a density to the daily workings of this relationship like very few other bilateral relationships do on the face of the earth.